Welcome to Love Your Job, Love Your Life podcast. This is episode number 10. And today I am joined by James. James is the head of people for Venitus. Hopefully I've said that right. Venitus?
Yeah, Venitus, that's right.
And Venitus are a advertising business, but they specifically focus on actually advertising within the gaming industry. So it sounds like quite a cool business, James. But welcome to the podcast. Great to have you on. And I know, because we've talked about it before, we've got a very interesting conversation to have today. Something that in all of my years of being in the corporate world, I've never actually thought of until we spoke the other week. So I look forward to that. Hopefully that got enough people interested to stay tuned. But welcome, James.
Thanks very much. Pleasure to be here. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Good. So just to kickstart, before we get into the terminology that you used when we were catching up the other week, one of the things that I come across an awful lot in my world when I talk about employee engagement and I talk to businesses about engagement, is everyone talks about this word called attrition. And one of the biggest signals for me is when an organization talks about attrition, they go, "Oh, we've got major attrition problems, James. You know, there must be something to do with engagement." But actually you have a slightly different view on that. But why is it that, in your opinion, with all the businesses you've worked with in the past, James, why is it that so many organizations focus on this, negativity around attrition and trying to influence that to make sure they retain as many people? Why is it that organizations focus on that so much?
I mean, it's a really good question. And I think it goes back to the shift of HR and the sort of the people profession wanting to be more data driven and wanting to have numbers and figures that they can rely on and use to sort of see how effective they are within a business. And attrition is one that you can really get quite easily. It's a number that you can calculate internally. It varies, it moves, and it's become, like you say, this almost measure of how effective an HR team is within a business. And I think that's where it's become kind of almost a buzzword within HR itself. And I think it's just become, there's almost this kind of fear of attrition being negative, and therefore it's a way that a business might be able to say, well, do we need to spend this much on HR? Is it something that we should be focusing on as a business? Are they doing a job that's good enough for us as a business? And I think that's where I think that the focus has come from initially.
Yeah. And I suppose, that can be, attrition can be viewed very differently depending on the size of the business. So I know when I've worked in some of my previous roles, big corporates, 50,000 people plus, head of talent acquisition when I was there. And, people talked about attrition all the time because we had quite a lot of turnover. So it's that leaky bucket type scenario of how do you plug the holes to stop people leaving? The impact in a large organization when you've got lots of people leaving, you've got to do lots of recruitment. The impact in a smaller organization, or I know where you are, you've gone through quite a lot of rapid growth over the course of the last 12 months or so. Attrition where you are is also can be quite damning or can have a knock-on effect from a business perspective, right? So do you think that that's another challenge that organizations face?
Completely. I think there's this sort of fear that you have single points of failure within the business, and if turnover happens within those ones, it's going to have an impact on the business for a period of time. Are you going to be able to replace that person at the same level they're currently working at? How quickly can that happen? How quickly can they get up to speed and have the same effect as the person that's left? Is that person going to leave and take some of the business with them? There's a lot of concerns. And I think that the thing here, as we'll get into deeper, I'm sure, later on, this isn't an approach that I think will work for every single business and maybe not even for every single department within a business. However, I do think there's a mindset change that we can bring about that will help to, I think, allay some of those fears and set businesses up in a better way to deal with attrition when it happens. You're never going to stop people leaving businesses. That's the nature of it. People will leave for good reasons, for bad reasons, for business decisions, for personal decisions. So there's lots to consider, but I think the better prepared we can be for that, the better we can position ourselves as businesses to deal with it.
Yeah. And mindset is really important, right? Because I often think about it, and these are lots of the conversations that I used to have when I was in TA that sort of said, you have somebody leave, somebody resigns, they're on a 4-week notice period. By the time it might have gone through an approval internally to get that role signed off, which often happens, not come across many businesses where they go, oh, someone's resigned today, you can fill the role today. So that takes a couple of weeks. Then you have to advertise. Then you have to go through a process. Then you have to decide. And then that person has a notice period. And before you know, sometimes you've got 4, sometimes 8, sometimes even 12 weeks where you've not got somebody in a seat. And that's the bit that can be damaging, right? Because that's where the loss of productivity in the organization comes from. That's where the loss of, maybe in sales, the loss of new business coming in comes from. So you mentioned their mindset, and you then mentioned that this might not be for every business out there, but it's a really interesting one. And I kind of don't want to put the spoiler out there of what you called it. So when you think about it, what are you calling it, James?
So it's kind of reverse attrition is how I'm thinking about it. And that maybe doesn't quite explain it or describe it in the right way. But I think that the way that I want to view it and the way that I would encourage other businesses, HR teams, TA teams to think about it is that, like I said, attrition will happen, turnover will happen. If we can accept that, and if we can get to a point where not necessarily encourage it, but be willing and able to accept that, have really honest conversations, have great plans in place so that when it does happen, we can deal with it in a positive way that will have the smallest impact possible on the business, then I think it gives us an opportunity to build much better relationships with our employees. Employees build much better relationships with their line managers. I think if I think about it on a bigger scale, it means that things like job markets probably become more, they move quicker, which generally tends to work quite well. And it allows, I think, development across different business sizes. Like you said, it can be quite difficult depending on what the size of the business is and how you deal with that. It might mean mass recruitment, or it might mean that they're stopping productivity for a period of time. But I think different businesses can approach this in a different way that will allow them to be successful and not have to be so fearful of attrition in the way that I think it typically is right now.
Yeah. So what you mean is actually that rather than, and I'm going to kind of paraphrase this in a slightly different way to see if I've understood what you're saying, is actually most managers won't ever have a proactive conversation with their team, with their employees, with their people that says, how are you feeling? How are you getting on? What are your plans? What are your plans? Full stop. Not what are your plans for success in this business for the next 12 months, but what are your plans? Actually, and we'll talk a minute about how we change the narrative, but you're almost saying it's okay for people to sit there and go, I've got 6 months left in this business.
Absolutely.
And to actually highlight and say, look, I am proactively looking for another job because I don't believe that my next role is here. I might have outgrown the business or whatever it might be. That's kind of what you're saying by saying reverse engineering that attrition in a positive light to say, it's okay to tell us that you're not happy, and it's okay to tell us that maybe your next step is elsewhere. Is that what that's what you're saying?
Yeah. And I think I've certainly experienced it both personally, and I've seen it happen in other businesses where you hit that glass ceiling. And that may be because it's a smaller business that just simply doesn't have that next step available and may not have for a significant period of time. Or it may be that you're in a much larger business and you just don't see progression within there. Maybe that's not where you see yourself in that larger business longer term. And if you can have an honest conversation with your line manager to accept that, in some cases, it might even be the line manager that has recognized that and communicates that to somebody within their team. Hopefully, they've got really high achievers within their team, but they know that there isn't going to be that next step, that progression that they deserve that's going to come up in the next 6 months, 12 months. It could be 2, 3, 5 years away, or it may never come about. Having that conversation, like I say, builds that relationship, allows those conversations to manifest even further. And it means that the line manager can then plan. If they know that person is looking for another role, they can go, okay, well, do we need to start a recruitment process ourselves, or at least thinking about what that looks like, get sign off for a role so that if and when it happens, they can move quickly. They can put plans in place so handovers can happen really quickly so that that next person can come up to speed as quickly as possible. We always talk about that. How quickly can we get the new hire up to speed? You can do that quicker if you can plan for it further in advance. Yeah. But also then the individual themselves can sit there feeling comfortable that they're not going to walk away from a business. And if they've got that great relationship, they're not going to leave them in a difficult position. But they can be honest about it. They can say, what does my next step look like? And hopefully the conversations they have, the line manager can say, well, I think your strengths lie here, here, and here. These are the roles that I think you should be looking for. These might be some companies that I think are looking for those kind of roles. And I think it's just a support network that you can build across the business. It fosters great communication, great relationships. And if and when that person leaves, they leave in such a positive way. Your employer brand becomes far better because somebody's going out probably into a similar market and saying what a great experience they had at that business, which means that if it's happening at other places and somebody at that place is looking to move, they're going to go, well, maybe I should think about a role in that business if and when I'm ready. And I think what happens then, as I was talking about job markets, it means that connections can happen much better and opportunities can be filled, I think, quicker because there's just great sort of feedback happening across all the different things and career progression becomes better because you can move around. And as we sort of spoke about last week, it doesn't mean to say that you leave that business and that's it. It might mean that you leave that business, get great experience for 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, who knows how long. And then at that point, an opportunity comes back at the previous company that you worked for, and you're in a better position to go back. You understand the business, you respect the way that they dealt with you in the first place, and you want to go back. You want to go and support them because they supported you. And likewise, they let you go for a positive reason, and they're really keen on bringing you back with the additional skills, experience, maybe qualifications that you've picked up elsewhere.
Yeah. And this is so theoretically, this sounds really good, James. And what you've just explained actually helps people to understand how it might happen. But this is a massive, and I'm going to say leap of faith almost for both businesses and also employees in that business, putting kind of trust and faith into a new process. And you mentioned the market there as well, the job market. There's a bit of a war of talent. There's been a bit of a war of talent out there for quite a while. That makes organizations very nervous, and actually that puts candidates in a very good position if they're a strong candidate. But how do you kind of operationalize this? And I suppose operationalize it at more of a manager-employee level, because the further up the hierarchy you go, often these conversations, they don't happen all the time. But I remember the conversation I had with my chief people officer when I left Capita, and it was a very honest conversation. I said to him that, look, I think my role is done. I came in to do a transformation piece, and he asked me that question, what's next for you, James? And I said, I'm not actually sure, Scott, because I'm not a BAU person. I'm a transformation fix-it person. And we started that conversation. And then I said to him, actually, I've decided that I'm at some point this year going to leave, but I'll give you the heads up when I'm going to leave. And I did. And then I left. So actually, I was very open with him, but it was a sometimes these honest conversations happen at a higher level in an organization. How do you see it working kind of more operationally lower down or operationally kind of that, as I say, that manager-employee relationship?
So you're absolutely right. Something like this is never going to happen overnight. You're not going to be able to kind of force these conversations, force those type of relationships to happen really quickly. It's going to have to be something that you build up over time. And I think like anything, you're going to need support from senior people within the business and make sure that they are supportive of this as a process, as a procedure, and that they communicate that to the business as a whole. We don't want to be seen as a business that holds people back. And if that means that our attrition rate increases, we're okay with that because we think it's the best thing for you. And in turn, it may take a little bit of time. It will be the best thing for the business as well. And I think the other thing is just make sure that really honest conversations are happening across a number of different topics. It doesn't need to just be about this. It's going to be about performance, about, how, like you say, ask the question, what does your future look like? You're probably not going to get a really honest answer to that the first time you ask it from most people. But keep asking, keep kind of trying to find out what people look like. And for the employees themselves, I think, again, it is a leap of faith. You've got to have that confidence that if you say, I'm not sure that this is the right role for me anymore, or that I don't think this business is the right place for me to be in the long term, that is going to be responded to in a manner that you're not then going to kind of be pushed out of the business, or that you're not going to be forgotten about, or, you know, your potential within the business is not going to be fulfilled because you've tried to be honest about it. Yeah, it's not straightforward. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. It is very much an overall, it needs to be holistic, that both the business and the employees want this to happen. And I think one of the ways to go about it from a business perspective is initially to think about the single points of failure that you have in the business. Most businesses have them, where if somebody left, it's going to have an impact on profit, operations, efficiency, effectiveness for a period of time. And I think if you can go to those people and be really honest and say, you're very good at what you do. We understand that if you were to leave, we would be in a difficult position. What's the best thing for this? You know, is there an opportunity in the business, or is there a way that we can help guide you, train you, offer qualifications, skills, training? Or do we need to think about this a little wider than we normally would, so that you feel comfortable, but we can then start planning for what the next steps are for both sides, for the individual and for the business? I think that might be the better place to go, because generally speaking, not always, but generally speaking, those high performers are very well respected. They tend to have good relationships with their line managers. So I think that openness, that honesty is probably more likely to occur.
Yeah. And when I think about that in the past as well, situations that I've been in, often organizations have these conversations about people, but they often have them behind closed doors. So again, there's multiple examples where I've worked with organizations where, you know, you position people and you absolutely ask those questions of, if this person was to leave, what's the impact of the business? Oh, it would be devastating. But then you don't follow through on that and go and talk to them and go, actually, we really don't want you to leave. So what can we do to keep you? And can we keep you? And if we can't keep you, what's then the succession plan that sits behind it as well? Because that's another big thing, James. And I don't know if you've got anything you could add to this conversation, but when organizations look at succession, the same thing can happen. You kind of put people and go, you know, James, your successor is X, their successor is Y, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you go down through the business. But then again, one of the things that falls over is you don't then talk to those people that are on that succession plan about, you are my successor. Now, when I left Capita, I absolutely had a successor, and then she had a successor, and then that person had a successor. So I kind of teed all of those moves up behind me when I left. But most organizations don't do that. But I guess that becomes a really important part in this conversation, right, James?
Completely. And just to sort of take that back, just to the sort of very start of your point there, it's really common that, like you say, conversations have behind closed doors. They don't involve the individual that is that sort of single point of failure.
Yeah.
And then what happens is they go, we'll give them a pay rise. And you give them a pay rise. And then in 3 months' time, you're wondering, is that enough? And then you have to do something else. And you look at the package as a whole, you have to keep offering these things. Money's great, but it's only a motivating factor up to a certain point. There's lots of research that sort of shows that. But at some point, your finance team or your board or somebody is going to say, we can't keep doing this. And what happens then? You haven't had the conversation directly with that individual. They've maybe gotten used to the fact that they've had pay rises every 6 months or every 12 months that have been relatively significant. But then you have to turn around and go, sorry, we can't do that anymore. You've kind of backed yourself into a corner. And this, I think, is where that succession planning then becomes really, really important. And in some cases, that successor may not be somebody that's in the business, because it's a one-person team, or it's one person and then people that are maybe too junior to step into that role. So if you've got that opportunity, if you've got people that have the potential to step into that role, succession planning is absolutely vital, and making sure you're having conversations with those people to say, we want to prepare you for that role. We don't know whether that's going to be ready at any point, but we want to prepare you for that role. Hopefully it's with us. If it isn't, it's the same conversation. We are happy for you to go and use the skills that we have given you elsewhere. But at the same time, if you don't have that internally, you need to start thinking about what that needs to look like from a recruitment perspective, so that if a new person comes into the business, they can step into that role. So making sure that the current employee has documentation, you know what their role involves on both a strategic and a day-to-day level. The other people in the business that maybe work with that person on a regular basis might be able to step in here and there as that new person comes into the business. They've got support. You've got kind of cross-functional workers that are able to help out in different ways, because again, that goes to helping people progress because they learn a wider part of the business. I've always said personally, if my part of the business is from D to E, I want to understand from A to K or something like that, to make sure that I understand the upstream and downstream activities of what my work is, and that if and when I need to, I can help out, or at least understand what's happening either side, so that there's maybe just a little bit more of an understanding if there's a blocker either from my part, what effect that's going to have downstream, or if something hasn't come to me, what's happening upstream that's affecting that. And I think that's key to across the business, to make sure that you've got that so that people can support as and when things happen. You hope it never happens, but if somebody is ill or becomes incapacitated for a period of time, this also kind of feeds into that as well, making sure that you've got those people within a business that can step in really quickly to provide a level of support for however long that period of time might be.
Yeah. And we've talked here very much from an organizational perspective, really around kind of some of the things that you need to think about and the benefits of doing it from an organizational perspective. But, go back to the podcast, love your job, love your life. If organizations do this effectively, there's also a huge impact for the employee as well, because the employee probably then, they have this psychological safety, as most people would call it, to be able to actually say, do you know what? And in my terminology with my model, James, it's I'm on a roller coaster ride, James, because, I've done everything I can here and I'm not sure what the next step is. And the next step is probably the bit that takes me from a roller coaster to flying high, right? So it's all about psychological safety and building that into the process. But from an employee perspective, for an individual's perspective, I guess it also has huge benefits for them as well, outside of the psychological safety of being able to have an honest conversation with their boss. And there's probably a whole host of other benefits for them, right?
Absolutely. Most people have looked for a job whilst they've been in another job. It's really difficult because you almost feel like you've got to be very stealthy about it, because you don't want your current employer to find out that you're looking for another job. This completely transforms that. It means that you can be on LinkedIn, and I'm using LinkedIn as the obvious example because it's what most people use, but it means you can be honest on LinkedIn if you want to have the open to work banner. I know there's a whole separate conversation around that, but if you want to do that kind of thing, you can, because you're not deceiving your employer. You're being honest about this. They're supportive of it. And it means that you can be more proactive about looking for a new role because you've got that support from the person who otherwise it's really difficult to do that. You can network better in terms of with recruiters and with other people in your industry and that kind of thing. You can, I would hope that businesses are then a little bit more understanding about taking time off for interview and interview prep and that sort of thing. And even providing support for those things too, because in most cases, people only interview when they're looking for a new job. So there can be years and years between one interview and another interview. And, nowadays AI is becoming far more prevalent in the interview process. And a lot of people wouldn't know how to deal with that. So if the only practice you're getting is kind of real life practice, it becomes far more difficult to then get better at it. If you've got an opportunity to work with an internal TA team on how they interview, you can improve your own skills. So yeah, I think it opens lots of doors, and the psychological safety piece is so important, just to make sure that they know that if a conversation is had, and again, thankfully this has never happened to me, but I've heard examples of somebody's looking for a new role and somehow it gets back to their current employer, and that conversation becomes really awkward.
Yeah. It does. And it is hard. You're absolutely right. When you're looking for another job, it can be very difficult, and you have to be stealth-like, and you have to kind of be careful about what you put in your diary and who you tell and where you go. It's probably, I'm going to use the word easier in this hybrid working world that we live in today. Rewind the clock when everyone was in the office and you'd scurry off into a little side office to take a phone call, and everyone would go, "What are you doing?" Which was always quite interesting and fun. But it has helped, but it makes a massive impact for the individual. Again, when I work with clients and we talk about engaging people and that openness and transparency, that's part of the reason why I developed the Engage to Succeed model, to help people to be much more open about where they are and what's missing from their job, what's missing from their life, to help them to engage themselves more. Because fundamentally, it's about the individual engaging themselves, and that sometimes leads to these difficult conversations. So, look, this is a really interesting debate, James. I'm sure that people will have varying different degrees of views on this. Of, oh, that sounds a bit risky, or oh, I really like that idea. If anyone is out there, CPOs, heads of HR, heads of people, senior business partners, TA professionals, my network is quite varied and wide across all of those categories of people. What would maybe some initial thoughts or hints or tips that if somebody says, actually, do you know what, that's a really different way of looking at it, where do I start? Where would you say is the best place to start, or to start thinking about how they could change some of their current processes to adapt to this?
But I think, obviously, a really, really important question. I think the way to think about it fundamentally is happy and engaged employees make better, more productive employees. And there are many ways you can go about trying to do this. And I genuinely think this is something that not many businesses that I've come across have thought about. And if you can say that to an employee, I believe they will automatically think, this business actually cares about me. They care about me. They care about my future, my progression. This isn't all about the business. And I think I've come across that as well, where you just think I'm a small cog in a big machine. I'm a number, nothing more. I think we need to move away from that. And I think you've sort of seen that in the HR profession in some cases, where it's moved kind of from personnel to HR to now kind of the people profession. And I'm of the belief that HR needs to provide support both to the business, but also to the employee. So I think it needs support, as I said earlier, from the senior team, but also from HR, from people, to make sure that they are comfortable with it. And I think the other thing to think about is, just because you start having these conversations, it doesn't mean your attrition is going to go through the roof. It just means that you're okay with it if it does start to increase, and that you are then more prepared for it. So if CPOs, if heads of people, anybody like that thinks that this is a good idea, be honest with it. Have a conversation with your CEO. It doesn't mean that you're going to implement it from tomorrow. It's probably going to take a few conversations to get an understanding of what that looks like. Have conversations with teams where those single points of failure, because I think they're quite likely to get on board if it means that they can start planning for the future from a succession perspective. Like I said, whether that's internal or thinking about what replacements look like. And the more people you can get on board, the easier it is to implement something like this. And it will take time. There's no doubt about that. It's not an overnight fix at all.
No. And actually, weirdly, I think you have to be comfortable with attrition changing. But I actually think if you start having these conversations, your attrition will be, and I could throw another terminology in here, would be good attrition rather than attrition, because inadvertently you'll probably find in the short term you'll have less people leave, because they'll be having more open, honest conversations with the business around where they are, what they're doing, how they're feeling. And this is what I've seen with clients that I've worked with my engagement model, the Engage to Succeed model, because it helps people to go, actually, this is where I am, and this is why I'm where I am. And therefore the manager or the leader or whoever it is can go, oh, well, that's a really easy thing to change and adapt. We could do this that then helps that. We could do this that then helps that. And invariably, the action to improve doesn't cost anybody anything. It's just doing the right thing a lot of the time.
Completely. I think the way that we look at it and the way that we kind of manage attrition is through regrettable or non-regrettable turnover. I think that the sort of North Star is to get to that point where there is no such thing as regrettable attrition. People are leaving because they're either underperforming or they're leaving, but you're okay with it because you've got things in place that mean that, yes, from a personal perspective, it might be, we would love to keep this person. However, from a business perspective, we're not going to regret this because we've got things in place that mean that we can continue to function, continue to work as a business. We can shake hands, wish them well. And if an opportunity comes up in the future to work with them again, we would be very happy to do so.
Yeah. And that is a beautiful way to close this down, James, remembering that. So thank you very much for your time. And I mean, we could probably talk about this for another half an hour because it's such an interesting, debatable topic of how you do things. But I really appreciate your time and coming up with this because it is a different way of looking at things. And when I talk about engagement with people, and whether it be a CEO of a business or an individual working in the business, the same thing applies, which is actually the more that you can put boundaries in place, the more that you can be honest, the more you can be open with your manager, your employees, whichever way you're looking at it, the more engagement you're going to get. And that's kind of what we're saying, right? That says, let's create an environment where openness is key. We're not shocked when someone comes to us and says, I've got another job, I'm leaving. You've got plans in place to make sure the business can continue to operate. And inadvertently, what you're going to do is you're going to increase engagement. And increasing engagement, as we know, increases productivity. Increasing productivity means you increase your revenue. Increasing revenue usually means you increase your profit, and everyone's happy. I've seen it a few times.
The world of work is changing, and I think we need to think about that as well. And the world of HR needs to change with it. Some ways in a kind of linear way, and other ways just to think outside the box occasionally.
Yeah. Brilliant. James, thank you very much for joining me on this. I've really enjoyed our discussion. I'm going to make an assumption here that if anyone wants to pick this up with you further, you mentioned LinkedIn earlier, so I would imagine that that's the best place to get hold of you, the professional network that is LinkedIn. And what I will do, if anyone is listening and wants to get in contact with James, I will put it in the comments, so you can just click the link below and feel free to connect in with James. James, thanks again for joining me. It's been a great pleasure having you on. And I wish you the best for the coming future.
Thanks, James. It's been a pleasure. Really appreciate your time.
No problem.